Hello to everyone in the virtual audience. My name is Sahar Aziz. I'm a professor of law and a Chancellor Social Justice Scholar at Rutgers Law School at Rutgers University in Newark. I'm also the Executive Director of the Center for Security, Race, and Rights, which is the only U.S. civil rights center at a law school that focuses on the civil and human rights of Muslims, Arabs, and South Asians. And so I will just use this opportunity to encourage everyone to check out the website at csrr.rutgers.edu. And it's my distinct pleasure today to be the moderator for a very important and timely panel entitled Blasphemy Laws in Islam and Muslim Majority Countries, and really seeking to answer the question, do blasphemy laws in Muslim majority countries violate Quranic teachings? This is a panel that is hosted by the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy, that is headed by Dr. Radwan Masmoudi, which I will introduce formally soon. But the CSID is an important institution for educating people, whether they're Muslim or non-Muslim, about the various political, legal, and philosophical and religious questions that fall under the umbrella of Islam and democracy, which unfortunately in the United States tends to be mistakenly interpreted as antithetical to each other. And so one of the reasons why I'm particularly interested in CSID's work is to rebut that stereotype that Islam and democracy are irreconcilable, and to really understand and dissect and disaggregate the difference between theology, politics, culture, history, sociology, economics, just as we do in the United States, to make sure that we also do the same type of enlightened and informed analysis of Muslim majority countries, rather than attribute all problems to religion in a simplistic and frankly Orientalist way. So in that regard, it's my pleasure to be here today to address a very commonly used kind of a weapon, blasphemy laws, to tarnish the reputation of Islam and to simplify it and essentialize it as if whatever blasphemy laws are passed or enforced in particular Muslim majority countries are in fact accurate interpretations of the faith, or are in agreement by all 1.5 billion Muslims, which is, I don't think there's one issue that's in agreement by 1.5 billion human beings anywhere, much less under one religion. So I will, the run of the show will be that I will introduce each speaker before they speak, and then each person will have 10 to 15 minutes to speak, and then we will go into Q&A between the speakers, and then we will open it up to the Q&A to the public. And there is a Q&A function on Zoom, so I encourage you to use it. I can't guarantee that your question will be asked, but I will try my best to address all the questions, and I will moderate them. Okay, so with that, the speakers today will be Dr. Khaled Abu Fadl, Dr. Mustafa Akyol, Dr. Ahmed Kuru, Dr. Bashir Ahmed, and Dr. Radwan Masmoudi. And again, I will introduce them before they speak. So we have our first speaker, someone who I am certainly among the many, many, many fans of, as an Islamic scholar that really needs no introduction, Dr. Khaled Abu Fadl, but many of us are fortunate to be students of his, whether directly or indirectly. He is one of the world's leading authorities on Sharia, Islamic law, and a prominent scholar in the field of human rights. He is the Omar and Esmeralda Alfi Distinguished Professor of Law at the UCLA School of Law, where he teaches international human rights, Islamic jurisprudence, political asylum and refugee law, the trafficking of human beings, law and policy, political crimes and legal systems, and Muslims, race, and the law. He was also formerly the chair of the Islamic Studies Interdepartmental Program at UCLA, and he is the founder of the Institute of Advanced Usuli Studies, also called the Usuli Institute, a nonprofit educational institute dedicated to ethics, beauty, and critical thinking in the Islamic intellectual tradition. Among his many honors and distinctions, Dr. Abu Fadl was awarded the University of Oslo Human Rights Award, the Leo and Lissel Ettinger Prize in 2007, and named a Carnegie Scholar in Islamic Law in 2005. In 2018, 2017, and 2005, Dr. Abu Fadl was also listed as one of Law Dragon's top 500 lawyers in the nation. And in 2013, he was recognized among the 50 smartest people of faith, mashallah, by bestschools.org, and was awarded the American Muslim Achievement Award in 2014. Dr. Abu Fadl has been ranked among the Power 500 list of the world's most influential Arabs and the world's most influential Muslims. So again, we were so honored to have you with us today, Dr. Abu Fadl, and I will now cede the virtual floor to you for 15 minutes to educate us on this important topic.
Thank you, Sahar. You're very kind. First, I am really, truly overwhelmed with a sense of gratitude and just feeling honored that I'm in the company of such great scholars and great minds. Every one of you is just stellar in your own right. It's just amazing, subhanAllah. So it's 15 minutes, so I'll try to be as direct as possible. So we all, I think, know that the text of the Quran itself is quite clear about the issue of coercion and religion. In fact, in terms of religious texts, I know no other religious text that takes at least the direct propositional position, لا إكراه في الدين قد تبين الرشد من الغي, or ولو شاء الله لآمن من في الأرض جميعا أفأنت تكره الناس على أن يكونوا مؤمنين, that there is no compulsion in religion, no coercion in religion, and even more explicitly, if Allah would have willed, everyone would have believed. And then asks sort of the rhetorical question, God speaking to the prophet saying, so do you think you have the right to coerce people into believing? Well, so the Quran itself is quite clear about this. I think that the morality of the Quran was quite ahead of its age. And not surprisingly, in my view, the medieval Muslim mind created fine distinctions between the laws of apostasy, the punishment of apostasy, which ironically, so many Muslim jurists say that an apostate can be punished for death, but this doesn't contradict no coercion in religion. Also, the penalties that classical Muslim jurists specified for the crime of insulting the Prophet. And when they mean insulting the Prophet, it doesn't mean criticizing the Prophet. It means actually using obscenities or slander. That doesn't surprise me in terms of the medieval mind. The idea of tolerating difference, or even the idea of freedom to believe, it took human beings a great deal of trauma and intellectual development to reach. So in many ways, the Quran was ahead of its time. Now, having said that, I think that even at the modern moment, people don't realize the extent to which Quran is surprising at many levels on the issue of freedom to believe. So for instance, when the Quran comments on the position of what I call the opposition group in Ghazwat Hunayn, in one of the main battles, or the Quran in Surah Tawbah comments on Ghazwat Tabuk and the dissenters who either refused to join the battle. Now, the Muslims have gotten accustomed to interpreting the Quran, saying that the Quran is talking about hypocrites, and that the hypocrites, the problem was in their faith. However, what a lot of people miss is that the Quran talks not just about hypocrites, but about hypocrites and mushrikeen, both hypocrites and non-believers who opposed the Prophet's decision and took a very contrary position to certain events, certain policies that the Prophet adopted. So what I'm saying is that non-believers existed in Medina at the time of the Prophet, and that non-believers continued to exist in Medina and later on in Mecca at the time of the Prophet. And that in the same way that the Prophet of Islam never took any actions against the so-called hypocrites, he also never took any actions against those who refused to become Muslim, both in Medina and later on after the conquering of Mecca, in Mecca itself. And we have a very long record where history records those who insulted, or other words, humiliated or attempted to humiliate or slander the Prophet of Islam, and without consequence. But nevertheless, the medieval jurisprudential mind was far more influenced by the laws, by the wars of apostasy that were launched by the first Khalifa Abu Bakr than they were influenced by the actual text of the Quran or their understanding of the Sunnah of the Prophet. Now, having said that, and because I know it's a very tight time, if so why haven't Muslims reinterpreted Islamic law to take clear, methodical positions against the laws that punish apostasy or laws that punish blasphemy in one form or another? Well, I think the answer is in the deficit of democracy in Muslim countries. And let me just say the most clear and unambiguous statement I can think of. Today, we live in a reality where in a country like Egypt, 100 million, over 100 million Muslims, a country like Egypt, you can, if you are sufficiently pro-government, you can say very critical things about Islam. In fact, you can say very critical things about Muhammad himself. Muslim airwaves every day are full of people like Ibrahim Isa or Nawal al-Saadawi, or when he was alive, Sayyid al-Qimni. Social media is full of individuals that live in Egypt that proudly declare themselves malahida, non-believers, and say some, but at the same time, you can get away with that. There is no way on the face of this earth that you can get away with criticizing Sisi. So we live in a reality in which we are asking people to accept the incomprehensible and the entirely paradoxical to them. Take a critical in what, for instance, in Egypt, they call Taqdeed al-Khitab al-Dini, renewing Islam, or renewing, where the dictator that rules the country, that single intellect that is at the top of the helm, who is entirely sacrosanct. You can't criticize that dictator directly or indirectly. The dictator is effectively more sacrosanct and sacred than the Prophet, than God, than the companions, than anyone. What you see in Egypt, you also see in Saudi, you also see in the Emirat, you also see in every despotic paradigm. And I think that, especially because of the history of dictatorship in the post-colonial era, and also the history of evangelism in Muslim countries under the auspices of colonialism, it has left us frozen in moment where, regardless of what the Quran says, the laws of apostasy, the inheritance of a medieval age, remain an issue because people react to dictatorship and to the transgressions of despotism by clinging to whatever tradition that gives them a sense of identity and dignity they can cling to. And they cling to that tradition often in irrational ways and in ways that are very difficult to negotiate with. I don't know how much time I have left, Sahar, but if I can say, I remember watching, and this is perhaps Dr. Radwan Maswoudi can comment on this if he wishes. I remember watching when Morsi died, there was someone in the Tunisian parliament that just wanted to read the Fatiha on the soul of Morsi. And the hysterics that I saw some people go into, in Congress, you can say prayers where you acknowledge Jesus all the time. But in Muslim countries, we are so thoroughly colonized that even reading the Fatiha in a parliament becomes an international event. And ultimately, when I saw the reaction to just someone reading the Fatiha in the Tunisian parliament, I knew that it would be a matter of time before that democratic experiment is overthrown, as always happened and has consistently been the pattern. So I don't think it's a simplistic matter of just saying, well, the Quran doesn't approve of coercion and expecting everyone to understand what that means and the full implications of that is. I'll stop here, and inshallah, if there are questions, I hope I said enough to ignite an interesting conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Khaled Abu Fadl. Yes, we have much to talk about. So the next speaker is going to be Mustafa Akyol. Mustafa Akyol is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity, where he focuses on the intersection of public policy, Islam, and modernity. Since 2013, he has also been a frequent opinion writer for the New York Times, covering politics and religion in the Muslim world. He is the author of Reopening Muslim Minds, A Return to Reason, Freedom, and Tolerance, which was published in 2021. He is also the author of Why, as a Muslim, I Defend Liberty, and the book, The Islamic Jesus, quote, How the King of the Jews Became a Prophet of the Muslims, published in 2017, and the book, Islam Without Extremes, A Muslim Case for Liberty, published in 2011. The Thinking Muslim, a popular podcast, has described Mustafa as probably the most notable Muslim modernist and reformer, and in July 2021, the Prospect magazine of the UK also listed him among the world's top 50 thinkers. So again, we are so delighted and privileged to have you, Mustafa, with us, and I will cede the virtual floor to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Aziz, and I'm privileged and honored, to be in the presence of such great scholars. Really, thanks to all of you, and thanks to Center for Study of Islam and Democracy for really organizing this. Now, Dr. Fadl, whose works have enlightened, I think, most of us, including myself for sure, just made a very important point, and several important points. But one is the distinction between the divine core of Islam, as we all Muslims believe, which is certainly in the Quran and the undisputed, clear example of the Prophet, and the medieval Muslim mindset that built our Islamic tradition. And by saying when there's a medieval Muslim mindset, the medieval jurisprudential mindset, we're not condemning it, actually. I mean, I use similar terminology too. We're just putting it in a context. When you look at all these blasphemy laws and apostasy laws, which we will discuss today, you see that, yes, Muslim jurists discuss that blasphemy is a capital offense. Just look at the Byzantine Empire just next to them at the same time, they had the exact same laws. Look at the Sassanid laws, they had very similar things. I mean, in that world, your allegiance to the state and your religion was basically the same thing. and states all had this, imperial states had these laws. So Muslims acquired those laws and they didn't think there's a problem with those. Just like they acquired slavery, adopted slavery, although you could have abolished slavery by taking the Quran's calling for freeing a neck as a more definitive, value, although it didn't happen. So today we live in a different world, and it is important to distinguish the religious from the historical. It's important to distinguish what's the core of the faith from its historical interpretations. And I think this is quite clear on this burning issue of religious coercion. And blasphemy laws are part of that, but there's a broader problem of religious coercion. That includes religion police forces, that are imposing hijab on women in Iran, right? For example, as we are speaking right now, there are mass protests in Iran, justified protests against so-called morality police, under whose authority just a young woman lost her life, unfortunately. And people are reacting to this idea that the hijab should be imposed by the state instead of Muslim women wearing it by their own choice, which is of course a very respectable and a rightful practice. And you see, of course, in Iran that is imposed, and in France, there's the other imposition, which are both wrong, by the way, I should say. Now, on this issue of coercion, one more thing. Dr. Fadl, of course, reminded the key Quranic verse when it comes to these issues, La ikraha fi din, at the beginning of Baqarah 256, there is no compulsion in religion. Now, if I'm been calling for taking that verse seriously and in its full implications, right? But that is precisely why some translations of the Quran today that you can find in Saudi Arabia or Malaysia that I myself encountered with, they put a parenthesis in that verse. So instead of there is no compulsion in religion, it reads, there is no compulsion in entering the religion, right? Why do they add that little, make that little operation? Because in their understanding, there's no compulsion only means not forcing the Ahl al-Kitab, the people of the book, to Islam. That was accepted. That was, by the way, a great thing for 1,000 years. I mean, Christians didn't do that like in medieval times. We did that, so we should be proud of that. But once you enter, things change, right? You cannot leave because they believe there are apostasy laws, although it has no basis in the Quran. And they believe that there are Hisba forces, religious police forces that can monitor your piety and punish you for not praying or fasting, again, which has no basis in the Quran, but which has some certainly presence in our fiqh, and some people are still trying to uphold those. Now, I believe we are at a phase in the Islamic civilization that this coercive understanding of Islam, religion should be coerced by authorities, by community on the individual, by the state on the individual, has brought us to a crisis at a time when people want freedom to be able to choose their beliefs and practices. And also it is incredibly counterproductive too, as we see in Iran, which has become one of the most secular Muslim majority societies, the #1 country that produces ex-Muslims. I always say people, becoming atheists or converting to Christianity, precisely because they are fed up with the regime that, oppresses them in the name of Islam. So this is a major issue, and blasphemy is, of course, a part of this. And I myself have written on this issue in my book, Reopening Muslim Minds, and elsewhere. So just like to highlight a few points there. Just like on the matter of apostasy, there is no basis for banning blasphemy in the Quran. The Quran never says go and punish the blasphemers. There's no verse that can justify that. Also, interestingly, the Quran sometimes quotes blasphemies against Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and responds to them. Now, that's very interesting. For example, you can read in the Quran that our Prophet was blamed to be a sorcerer, a madman, someone who's lying and creating these things out of himself or learning from somebody. This is interesting because I've noticed that in Pakistan, they have this conception that if you quote a blasphemous word, that becomes blasphemy too, and that should be punished as well. So people are afraid to quote what somebody who supposedly blasphemed said. Well, with that logic, you would actually think that the Quran is blasphemous too, because it's quoting these words that other people said about Prophet Muhammad. So, I mean, those verses show that our Prophet and the first Muslims lived in an environment that they saw. saw and faced these blasphemous words, disrespectful words, mockery, satire, all these things. How did they respond to those things? Now, one thing, no Muslim appreciates these things, right? I mean, we should be clear about that. We're not praising any disrespectful speech to Islam in the world. Quite the contrary, in a civilized world, everybody should respect each other's religious tradition. That is a medium I would prefer. I think most Muslims would prefer. But what if people say things that are not respectful to our religious tradition, our prophet, our God, or the Quran? Now, the Quran itself guides us on this. I mean, in Al Imran 186, there's a verse which says to first Muslims, you are sure to hear much that is hurtful from those who were given the scripture before you and from the polytheists. If you are steadfast and mindful of God, that is the best course. So you will hear, no matter what happens, you will hear hurtful words from people of other faiths, polytheists or other monotheistic traditions. And what you should do about it, it says be steadfast and mindful of God. Now, what does this mean? You can look in the tafsir of Fahrettin al-Razi, one of the towering scholars in our Sunni tradition, one of the greatest exegetes of the Quran. He comments on this verse and he says, there are a few people who think that this verse is abrogated by verses that call for war against the polytheists mainly, but the unbelievers in a certain context. But he says that's not a strong opinion. The right opinion is that the verse is not abrogated. I mean, the abrogation itself is a big problem we can speak about. I mean, the whole theory of abrogation. But he says this verse is valid. And then he says, this is because God wanted Muslims to show the beauties of Islam to non-Muslims and win them. He quotes other verses. He quotes the verse where Moses is told to go to the Pharaoh and speak to him gently. And Pharaoh is the evil incarnate in the Quran, right? I mean, that's the ultimate enemy. But Moses was ordered to speak gently. Then he quotes another verse which says, that is 45:14, tell the believers to forgive those who do not fear God's days. So Fahrettin Razi thinks that this approach of responding gently to offensive talk is valid, and that's the Quranic position. Now, we see this clearly in another Quranic verse, actually, which clearly guides Muslims what to do when people mock your religion. And that is Nisa 140, which actually confirms another verse in Surah An'am. It says, if you hear people denying and ridiculing God's revelation, now this is perfect blasphemy, right? People are sitting there denying God's revelation, making mockery of it. The verse says, do not sit with them unless they start to talk of other things, or else you yourselves will become like them. In my understanding, the verse calls for a boycott, right? Rejection of people who are disrespectful to your faith. So there are disrespectful people to our faith in the modern world today. We should not listen to their maybe speeches. We should not buy their books, publications. But the verse doesn't say go and silence them, let alone go and kill those people. So it just calls for disengagement with disrespectful people. So there's really no basis in the Quran for blasphemy, and that's very obvious. In the Sunnah, in the example of the Prophet, there are some episodes that have been later taken as the basis of blasphemy laws. And these are the famous issues of these poets that ridicule Prophet Muhammad, and not in the Quran, but we hear in the Sirah biography books and also a few hadiths that some of these poets were executed by early Muslims, and jurists said, yes, this is the basis for killing these people who mock our Prophet. And the most famous one is Ka'b ibn al-Ashraf, because he's also mentioned in hadith sources as well. So the story is that he was mocking the Prophet, and Muslims couldn't stand this mockery, and then he was given he was assassinated. But when you look at Ka'b ibn al-Ashraf, by the way, was a Jewish poet from the Banu Nadir tribe in Medina, and so it was a tribe that Muslims initially made peace with, but then it turned into conflict. But when you look carefully into these stories, you see that he was not just mocking the Prophet. He was a poet, and poetry at the time meant propaganda, and propaganda for war sometimes. After the Battle of Badr, he went to Mecca, incited the Meccan polytheists to fight against the Muslims. So he was doing what we would call today incitement to violence more than just mockery. And that's why scholars who looked carefully into the stories, one of them, some traditional scholars, one of them was Hanafi scholar Badr al-Din al-Aini in the 15th century. He said these poets were not killed merely for their insults of the Prophet, but it was rather because they aided the enemy against them and joined with those who fought wars against them and supported them. The same as I think can be seen in other stories as well, which I try to explain in my book. Now, that is the most interesting thing. There are, as Professor Abu Fadl said, there are also episodes where people mock the Prophet and the Prophet doesn't do anything against them. He even stops the companions for doing anything against those people. He forgives those people effectively. There are several cases of those. In one of them, he says, should we kill those people? And he says, no, be gentle and calm as Allah likes gentleness in all affairs. This is also in the Hadith and Sirah. So isn't this Sunnah? Well, there's a very interesting answer, which became very influential. Some scholars, including Ibn Taymiyyah, who was very prominent, of course, in the 14th century, he made the argument that, well, the Prophet had the right to forgive those people who insulted him, but we cannot forgive. So, and this has become a standard opinion, and it is quoted in Islamabad High Court decisions in justifying that penalty for blasphemy. Now, it's quite interesting because we're supposed to take the Prophet's actions as example in Sunnah, in every way. But when he forgives, no, we cannot do that because we don't want to forgive, right? We want to punish. That we somehow explain that away. I mean, there's a lot to talk about this, but if you look, there are blasphemy laws in fiqh, in classical jurisprudence, yes, as in Sassanid or Byzantine laws. But when you look into the Quran and the Sunnah, the undisputable sources of Islam, I think we can very clearly make the case that we don't need blasphemy laws, as we don't need apostasy laws, and they're not justified. And in the modern world, we're seeing that they're counterproductive. Especially blasphemy laws lead to punishing innocent people, sometimes with mobs who lynch them, sometimes through courts. That happens very often in Pakistan, especially, but elsewhere as well. It sometimes is used to silence other Muslims who are just thinking differently from you by calling them blasphemers or apostates, although they're pious Muslims. So this is a major problem, I think, in the world of Islam. And I think we Muslims don't need these things. They're not helping our religion. They're not right in the first place. So we should fully accept La ikraha fi din. There's no compulsion in religion, which means no apostasy laws, no blasphemy laws. Our faith is strong enough, to stand by its own virtue and by the faith of its believers. We don't need force, to coercion to uphold it, either in Muslim majority societies or elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mustafa Akyol. That was very informative. Again, lots to talk about during Q&A, and I will just remind the attendees, please use the Q&A function to ask your questions, and we will get to them once we finish, once we give every speaker an opportunity to give their comments. And so now we will move to Professor Ahmed Kuru. He is a professor of political science and the director of the Center for Islamic and Arabic Studies at San Diego State University. Professor Kuru is the author of the award-winning book, Secularism and State Policies Toward Religion, the United States, France, and Turkey. And his most recent book, entitled Authoritarianism and Underdevelopment, a Global and Historical Comparison, became the co-winner of the American Political Science Association's International History and Politics Award. Professor Kuru's works have been translated into Arabic, Bosnian, Chinese, French, Indonesian, Malay, Persian, and Turkish. And so again, we are so pleased and honored to have Professor Kuru with us, and the virtual floor is now yours, Professor.
Thank you, Sahar, and thank you to Radwan and CSID for organizing. I'm privileged and honored to be with Khalid, Mustafa, Bashir, and all the panelists. So let me start with the global picture. There are 70 countries with blasphemy law today. Half of them are Muslim majority countries. And there are three main problems regarding Muslim majority societies. First of all, overwhelming majority of them, 35 out of 50, have these laws. Second, They are against the trend because in the world, European countries are abolishing the laws, Muslim societies and countries having new laws with more emphasis. And third, their punishments are much more severe. 6 Muslim countries have capital punishment for blasphemy. Plus, they have apostasy laws. And in practice, we see, for example, in Pakistan, over 1,500 people have been charged with blasphemy. Over 100 persons have been lynched on the street by mob. This restrict not only freedom of speech and religion, but also restrict this country's chances of democratization and development. So, and is this only a state problem? It's not. It's also a societal problem. According to Pew survey of 2013, in the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and South Asia, 50% of the people or more say that Sharia should be land of the law. And among them, 70% in South Asia, 50% Middle East, 30% in Southeast Asia say that apostates should be killed. So this strong political and social dimensions, where is it the source? So both Khalid and Mustafa enlightened us about the weakness of these ideas coming from Quran and Sunnah. And in my book, Islam, Authoritarianism and Underdevelopment, a Global and Historical Comparison, I emphasize 2 issues where you see the gap between the Quran and the Muslim practices. One is not to killing Muslims, and there is emphasis on it, but Muslims still killing each other in civil wars, terrorism, and wars. Another issue related to development is making contract written. This is the longest version, 1-page verse in the Baqarah Surah, ordering Muslims to make every contract written. But when we analyze 15th and 16th century, when Europeans making written contract obligatory, starting with Italy, and then in Europe, they reached the level of 90% written contracts, whereas in the Ottoman Empire, even in Istanbul and other urban areas, written contracts was 5 to 10%. So the image in the West that whatever Muslim do are Quranic is a wrong image, because on many issues we see the gap. And where is it coming from then? Of course, the connection between politics and religion. And we refer rightly to medieval practices. But here in a few minutes, I want to divide medieval time to 2 periods. One is the time between 8th to 11th centuries, when Muslim ulama, the Islamic scholars, put a distance between themselves and the political authorities. Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, Hanbal, and Shafi, and also Shia scholars, regard politicians and rulers, sultanos, caliph, as corrupt. And at that time, there was a diversity, intellectual flourishing, economic prosperity, and creativity in the Muslim world. There were philosophers like Razi, who were agnostics, and they were bringing many ideas from Greek and other philosophies without any punishment and being killed as apostates or blasphemous. And at the time, we called Muslim Golden Era, between 8th to 11th centuries. But in the 11th century, because of many economic, social, political, military crises, and the Caliph Abbasi, Caliph Qadir's declaration of Qadiri Creed, where certain Shia and Mu'tazila declare infidels to be punishable by death. And where unfortunately, the great scholar Ghazali, at the end of his book, Tahfatul Falasifa, in 2 pages, he declared Ibn Sina, Farabi, and their followers as punishable by death because of their apostasy. And then since the 11th century until today, what I call ulama state alliance really represent this idea. And for them, apostasy and blasphemy are very important thing to keep their autonomy and power. Yes, during the Ottoman era, Tanzimat in 19th century, there were reforms. Secular reformers came in a very authoritarian manner from Turkey to Tunisia, from Egypt to Syria, and even Southeast Asia. But since 1970s, especially from the Iranian Revolution we discussed these days, 3 groups, ulama, Islamists, and unfortunately Sufi sheikhs, they propagate in their political parties, in mosques, in Sufi lodges, tekke, zaviye. Very radical, very restrictive ideas. And they make this idea of blasphemy very popular among the masses. Here, the results I just cited in the survey that many people embrace this idea of punishment. Because in the Islamist agenda, they have very few things. One is restricting women's rights, and the other is punishing blasphemy and apostasy in order to establish a hegemony. So what should we do if, as Khalid and Mustafa already explained well, that there is no Quranic or Sunnah sources, and if it is historical and power related, it makes us optimistic. But at the same time, we should not be overly optimistic, because for intellectuals like us, there are threats, that physical or violent threats coming from those who defend the hegemony. And at the same time, it's really very difficult to keep the middle ground, because today in the Muslim world, there is a very strong anti-religious secularization coming. In Turkey now, after the Islamist regime and whatever happening in the last 10 years, many people becoming anti-Islam, or what I call aggressive, assertive secularists. On the other side, as I say, Islamist ulama and Sufi sheikhs, they defend a very conservative Islam, and defending a moderate, tolerant, freedom-based Islam and discussing it, people like us, the secularist camp see us as naive. They say Islam is itself is an authoritarian ideology. You cannot recover, rehabilitate it. At the other side, call us kafir. They are infidel. You are apostate. And it's very difficult to hold the middle ground. And I am very much concerned about the future in Iran, in Turkey, even in some Arab countries. The secularist generation is coming. And when they came a very assertive secularist way, they may bring an anti-religious dictatorship, which is as bad as an Islamist dictatorship. And this issue of apostasy is key to really establish an opportunity of democratization and middle ground. That's the historical thing that really ended Muslims' golden age. The Ibn Sina, Farabi, Biruni, and others, they live in an atmosphere of diversity and coexistence until the 11th century and post-11th century ulama-state alliance. They restrict their ability to express themselves. That's why it's very important that we challenge the blasphemy and apostasy laws today. And that's why, as Radwan called, I see this panel historic. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Kuru. I'm already seeing many questions in the Q&A. I have my own questions, so this is wonderful. The more we speak about this, I think the more room we have for conversation. So the next speaker is Dr. Bashir Ahmed, who is a retired psychiatrist and a former professor of psychiatry at Southwestern Medical School in Dallas, Texas. He has been a social activist who's founded 3 major organizations in North Texas. The first is the Muslim Community Center for Human Services, which provides medical and social services to indigent residents of North Texas. Dr. Bashir Ahmed has also established the Institute of Medieval and Post-Medieval Studies in North Texas, which disseminates the information about Muslims' contributions to world civilization and inspires young Muslims to become scientists and innovators. And finally, Dr. Bashir Ahmed has created the Institute of Quranic Knowledge and Religious Acceptance, which promotes interfaith and intrafaith unity. And I would be remiss not to thank Dr. Bashir for all of his remarkable leadership in the Dallas community, which is a community that raised me. And so it's wonderful to see you, Dr. Bashir, again. And I look forward to hearing your comments. The virtual floor is yours. I think you're muted, Dr. Bashir. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Can you hear me? Yeah,
Yes.
okay. Thank you, Sister Sahar Aziz, for the nice introduction. It is a great honor to be with the great scholars, especially Professor Khalid Abu Fadl and others. I like to clarify first, I am not a Muslim scholar. I don't have any expertise on fiqh or Sharia law. I humbly studying, observing, following the implications of the blasphemy law and how it is tarnishing the name of Islam and how the Muslim reactions have such a profound negative effect that instead of controlling the blasphemy, they are actually spreading the blasphemy. If you think seriously, I think Muslims are responsible to spread more blasphemy in the world than non-Muslims have done. So I am going to summarize here what my observations have been in last 2 decades when I started studying the blasphemy and its effect. There is no doubt that whenever Prophet, Islam, or Quran has been insulted, it hurts Muslims. It hurts their feelings because they love their religion. They love our Prophet, peace be upon him. But we need to definitely understand how their reaction is giving the bad name to Islam. Sharia laws related to blasphemy were devised during the early period of Islam to safeguard, to discourage people from using blasphemy to tarnish the name of the Islam. But unfortunately, many Muslim countries today have the laws which is resulting in incarceration or sometimes even execution. Iran, Pakistan, Saudi Arab, Sudan, Somalia, and many countries have death penalty. And unfortunately, the misunderstanding and the abuse of these laws are affecting many Muslims and also people of minority faiths, like Baha'is in Iran, Qadianis in Pakistan, and Shias in Saudi Arab, Christians in Egypt and Indonesia and some other Muslim countries often face frequently the blasphemy. And there are about 1,500 people now incarcerated in Pakistan with charges of blasphemy. Although there was no execution of any person with the blasphemy charges, but there are 80 to 100 people who were killed by lynching mobs. I know you all heard about stories of how people are blamed, like Asiya Bibi, a village woman was blamed for blasphemy, incarcerated life. The sad part is when the governor, Tehsil of Punjab, and Minister Bhatti of Pakistan federal government raised the question for fair trial, they were killed. They were killed by the perpetrator. And 1,100 ulamas supported the perpetrator, saying that he is right, killing a blasphemer. Why they call blasphemer? Because they are simply asking a fair trial, which is in accordance with the Quran and even with the Sharia laws. And this is the serious question. 12 employees were killed, Charlie Hebdo in France. It became an international crisis. Many heads of the states of Muslim governments had to apologize to French government. Samuel Paty was murdered because he was teaching freedom of speech and he was showing the cartoons. Junaid Hafiz was a Fulbright scholar who was incarcerated with charges of blasphemy. And when he was sentenced, it was life imprisonment. The lawyer who was trying to defend him, the perpetrator, killed him. And the judge who was presiding his hearing, he was threatened and he had to leave the country. There was a student in Wali University in Peshawar. He was brutally murdered, and ulama supported the perpetrators. Zafar Bhatia is a Christian, and he was alleged to have blasphemy in his writing, and he was incarcerated for 10 years, and last year he was sentenced to death. A Nigerian Muslim, who is a son of the Muslim scholar, was critical about Orthodox Islam, and the government punished him for 24 years. A Sri Lankan man who simply removed the posters where the name of Prophet was written, and he was brutally killed. Is this giving a good image of Islam? And this is the question I often raise for the Muslim scholars. Blasphemy laws are un-Islamic because they violate the teachings of the Holy Quran and sayings of Prophet Muhammad. Nearly all prophets were abused. They were called liars, fabricators, sorcerers, but Quran has never mentioned to kill the opponent. Even those prophets have never charged them or asked their supporters to kill them. This is what the Quran teaches. Quran says, I think, as already mentioned, if the God's revelation was mocked or they are ridiculed, don't sit with them, leave them unless they change the subject. And another verse says, if they are uttered blasphemy and repent, that's good for them. But they, if return to their voices, their wrongdoings, Allah will punish them. In Quran, all the time, it says that the punishment will be by God in life after death, not in this world. But why we don't follow those verses? That's my major question. If death would have been punished, supported by Quran, our Prophet would have been the first one to order killing his opponents. He didn't. He lived with them all his life in Medina, but there are a lot of people who opposed them. We heard the story of the woman who used to throw garbage. When she didn't come out one day, he asked for help. That's what we have to follow. There was a poet, Sohail bin Amr, who was using blasphemy, but when he was arrested, our Prophet said, don't treat him badly, show compassion, treat him gently. Once the Prophet was asked whether somebody should kill his chief hypocrite, his name was Abdullah bin Abi. The Prophet said, don't do that, because people will say, you kill your companions. The brutal acts against the blasphemers have only threatened, increased tremendously the increase of blasphemy. I will give you just 3 examples. When Salman Rushdie fatwa was passed against him, the sales of book has increased tremendously. He became a rich person and he got great honors bestowed on him from the British government. His books were translated in several languages. The person who translated his book in Satanic Verses in Italian, he was shot. Luckily, he was not killed. But the person who translated his book in Japanese, he was murdered. What a good examples we are setting. The Muslims killed 12 people in Paris with Charlie Hebdo publication. The next edition the Charlie Hebdo published was 8 million copies. Usually they published 60,000. So the blasphemy was spread for 60,000 people. Now it did increase to 8 million people. And that was translated in 6 languages. Are we suppressing the blasphemy? Are we increasing the blasphemy by our action? Samuel Paty, when he was killed, how it affected government in France closed the major mosque in Paris and deported hundreds of people, Islamic imams, teachers, and scholars. And this is what the negative effect I am talking about. Blasphemy and apostasy laws, it violated human rights. It violated freedom of expression. Quran emphasizes the importance of tolerance, forgiveness, and mercy. Forgiveness enhances our relationship, and it is possible that the perpetrator might accept that Quran may be a religion of peace, and it will enhance our image in the world. Sharia laws are devised by human interpretation of Quran and prophetic sayings. This should be reviewed and revised so that we can prevent harmful effect of these laws on individual and society. As people living in the West, we enjoy many rights and freedoms that are not available to our brothers in the Muslim world. So I'd like to conclude just by saying 2 things. We believe it is our responsibility to voice our concerns about how these barbaric behavior violates basic principles of human rights and simultaneously insults both Quran and Prophet Muhammad. So in the conclusion, I will say that we need to seriously consider the blasphemy laws and their applicability in 21st century. We need to pay attention to many modern Muslim scholars who suggest that these current blasphemy laws violate the teaching of Holy Quran and sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, and these laws are not applicable today. I would seriously request all scholars to consider making the changes in the existing laws or even abolishing the laws. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Bashir. More food for thought. Okay, we are now at our final panelist, who is arguably one of our most important ones because he is the executive director of the organization that's hosting this event, the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy. And many of us are grateful for Dr. Radwan Masmoudi's tireless efforts as the founder and president of the Center of the Study of Islam and Democracy, which is a nonprofit think tank based in Washington, D.C., dedicated to promoting freedom, democracy, and good governance in the Arab and Muslim worlds, as well as improving relations between the United States and the Muslim world. He is also the editor-in-chief of the Center's quarterly publication, Muslim Democrat. He is a member of the board of directors of the International Forum for Islamic Dialogue, the American Council for the Study of Islamic Societies, and the executive committee of the Network of Democrats in the Arab World. Dr. Masmoudi served as a member of the steering committee of the World Movement for Democracy between 2012 and 2022. Dr. Masmoudi holds a master's and PhD degree from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and has published several articles and spoken on major international conferences on the compatibility between Islam and democracy, the democratic transitions in Tunisia following the Arab revolutions and of 2011, and also is a frequent commentator in various mainstream media. And so without further ado, Dr. Masmoudi, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sahar, and all the panelists. It's a pleasure to be with you today. Thank you, everybody, for participating in this very important webinar. I also want to thank the Southern Methodist University Human Rights Program for co-sponsoring this webinar, and also Mr. Sayyid Hadi Jawad and other leaders of the American Muslim community in Dallas, North Texas, who reached out to me almost 2 months ago after the terrible attack on Salman Rushdie in New York, and suggested the idea of co-organizing this webinar. And of course, I immediately welcome the idea and support the idea. So I'm happy that it's finally taking place. I always believe that if we want Islamophobia, the fear of Islam in the West, to subside or to end, we need to speak up about our faith. We need to speak up about what Islam truly stands for. And also we need to change the reality on the ground in the Muslim majority countries. It's not enough to say, in theory, Islam supports all these rights, because most people in the world don't care about the theory, they care about the practice. What's going on in the Muslim countries, in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, in Iran, in Saudi Arabia, that's how people in the United States or all over the world will judge Islam and Muslims. So we need to address both the theory and the practice of what Islam truly is and what it stands for, not only the theory. So one of the biggest misunderstandings today about Islam is that it does not stand for freedom of religion, or it does not stand for and respect freedom of conscience, or that it punishes those who criticize it, or that it imposes itself on believers and non-believers alike in the Muslim countries. So to me personally, the biggest proof that this is not true is the fact that Islam has coexisted peacefully and in harmony with other religions and religious minorities, and sometimes even majorities, for the past 14 centuries, all over the globe, from Nigeria to Spain, Andalusia, from Iraq and Iran and Egypt and Palestine, where you still have very significant and large Christian and Jewish minorities, to India, Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, many other countries where Islam and Muslims coexisted and lived together in peace for centuries. If Islam did not tolerate and allow these religious minorities to exist, and by the way, religious minorities include other minorities within Islam itself. There are different schools of thought within Islam itself. If Islam did not allow these minorities to exist or to practice their religion freely and to live in peace and harmony, these religious minorities, hundreds of millions of people all over the globe, would not exist today after so many centuries, almost 14 centuries. But today, I want to focus on one specific example in the few minutes that I have. The question of freedom of religion and freedom of conscience in the new Tunisian constitution of 2014. As you know, this was the first and only democratically written, drafted, and approved constitution in the entire Arab world. In 2011, we had a popular uprising demanding freedom, dignity, and democracy. And so at the end of 2011, the Tunisian people elected a national constituent assembly to draft and approve a new constitution. 217 people, roughly a third of them were women, were elected to write a new constitution for the new democracy. 2 years, it took 2 years of discussions, of very intense discussions all over the country, in every village, in every city, very intense discussions about all the clauses in this constitution for 2 years, for 2 full years, took place across the country in order to build a consensus, because we wanted a constitution for all Tunisians, not for the majority of Tunisians, and allow 30% or 40% of Tunisians to not approve the constitution. That would be terrible for the new democracy. So that's why it took too long. It took 2 full years. But one of the biggest and thorniest questions in the new constitution, and believe me, there were several thorny questions, but one of the biggest and most difficult ones was the question of freedom of religion and freedom of conscience. Basically, should we allow citizens to choose their own religion? Remember, 98% of Tunisians are Sunni Arab Muslim, but the question was asked and should be asked is, are people in the new democracy, should people be allowed to choose their own religion or to change their religion or to have no religion at all? So there was very intense discussions on this topic. CSID, my own organization, we were in Tunis at the time, organized literally hundreds of meetings and conferences and seminars. Some of them, very similar to this discussion that we are having today. Some of them were open to the public, others were closed only for the politicians or the religious scholars to discuss these topics. The debates were often very heated and intense for 2 years, 24 months. And we had activities and discussions on a daily and weekly basis. So some conservative elements, whether politicians or religious leaders and scholars, said they wanted to protect the religion of Islam and the homogeneity of the society. Again, 98% of Tunisians are Sunni Arab Muslims. So they were afraid that if we allow freedom of religion or anybody to change his religion, it's going to become chaotic. It's going to become, we're going to lose this homogeneity of the society. And they did not want to encourage people or allow people to leave Islam. But again, there was these intense discussions, and some of them we have videos on, and they are posted on our website. The question was, what is really the best way to protect Islam? We all agree as Muslims, we want to protect Islam. We believe in the religion of Islam. But do we protect Islam by imposing it on people? Is that the best way to protect Islam? And forcing people to believe in it, even if they don't really believe in it? Whether they like it or not, we force people to believe in one religion. Can you really force people to believe in something if they don't really believe in it? Or is it by engaging people, especially the younger generation and the younger people, but anybody who has questions about religions, about faith, about God, engage in a free debate and discussion about Islam itself, about the true meanings and the values of Islam, of the religion. Do we want true believers in Islam or in any religion who truly believe in God and believe in the values and tenets of the religion? Or do you want hypocrites who claim to believe in the religion because they are forced to, by law or by the state, but in reality they do not? And they are saying that only because they are afraid or they are scared. And so, again, we had a lot of discussions about this. The question became, what does Islam, first of all, say about this, about freedom of religion and freedom of conscience? As was mentioned today by several of the speakers and the scholars, and they don't have time here to enumerate all the arguments or all the verses, but a very famous ayah is La ikraha fi din. Let there be no compulsion in religion. I mean, it's very clear, very specific. And then the same ayah continues, truth stands out clearly from error. Whoever rejects evil and believes in God has grasped the most trustworthy hand, and that never breaks. And Allah heareth and knoweth all things. So here, this verse makes it very clear that people should be allowed to choose their religion, to believe or not to believe. Another verse, وَقُلِ الْحَقُّ مِنْ رَبِّكُمْ فَمَنْ شَاءَ فَلْيُؤْمِنْ وَمَنْ شَاءَ فَلْيَكْفُرْ. Another very clear verse in the Quran, speaking to the Prophet, say, this is the truth from your Lord. الْحَقُّ مِنْ رَبِّكُمْ, the Quran and what I'm telling you is the truth. Then whosoever wants to believe, let him believe. And whosoever wants to disbelieve, let him disbelieve. Again, freedom of religion, freedom of conscience. Let whoever wants to believe out of choice, not out of compulsion. Another and final verse here that I want to mention. قد جاءكم بصائر من ربكم فمن أبصر فلنفسه ومن عمي فعليها وما أنا عليكم بحفيظ. Another verse in the Quran, there has come to you enlightenment from your Lord. So whoever will see it does so for the benefit of his soul. And whoever is blind and does not see it does harm against it. And say, I'm not a guardian over you. To the Prophet, I'm not a guardian. I'm not going to guard you or force you. It's your choice. So the main argument in Tunisia in 2012, 2013 became really this question of freedom of conscience, freedom of religion. The fact that you cannot force people to believe in something. Either he believes or he does not. And God has given us this freedom to choose, because it's inherent in the creation, inherent in the fact that we are ultimately accountable to God in the day of judgment, that we have to be free to choose. How can God, Almighty God, hold us accountable if we don't have the freedom to choose, if we are forced to believe or not to believe? So again, I don't want to take too much time, but after 2 intense years of discussions between religious leaders, scholars, the politicians from the various political parties, and the citizens who also participated in the discussion, we finally agreed that freedom of religion must be protected. Freedom of conscience must be in the Constitution as a protected right, and that people have the right to choose their religion. Article 6 of the 2014 Constitution says the state is the guardian of religion in general, not just the religion. It guarantees freedom of conscience and belief, and the free exercise of religious practices, and the neutrality of mosques and places of worship from all parties and politics. So this is a very strong statement that the state guarantees freedom of conscience and freedom of belief. Unfortunately, as you all know, Tunisia had a coup against democracy last year, July 25, 2021. And since that coup, Qais Said, the coup leader, has imposed a new constitution, which was imposed in a fake referendum, rigged referendum this past July 2022. And this article was removed from the constitution.
Okay.
So in the new constitution, in the new dictatorship, in the new coup against democracy, this article that protects freedom of religion and freedom of conscience is no longer in the constitution that was imposed by Qais Said. So I will end here and look forward to our your questions and our discussions.
Thank you. Thank you. That's actually the perfect end and segue into some of the questions that I'd like to ask. So for the rest of the, we're ending at 2, so we have 45 minutes to have a discussion, hopefully a robust discussion. And we'll start with a few questions I have. I'll kind of take advantage of my moderator's privilege, and then we will go to the Q&A. So if attendees want to add questions, they can. I can't promise I'll get to all of them, but I will try. But as I listen to all of this rich discussion, there are many kind of key themes that come up. So the first, I just want to state the obvious. We're talking about 50 Muslim majority countries, and you also have countries like India and other countries who have large Muslim minorities, and that totals 1.5 billion people. So as a result, it would be foolish to approach any issue related to Islam or Muslims as if there is some kind of simple or consistent solution or analysis. Arguably, we should have 50 different analyses for every country, and then different analyses when you have large Muslim minorities. Because I think what we all know is every country is different. And so the first thing I want to kind of start with is debunking the myth, this homogeneity and this essentialization of people simply because they share a common religion, even though they may have different interpretations, different even sects of the religion, different practices within that same religion. So as a result, the question I have is, can we even analyze blasphemy laws in the abstract? Obviously, we can have a theological discussion, which many of you did, but as some of the other speakers mentioned, it's, the interest, I think the impetus for this panel is because of the practical implications, right? And the different ways in which individuals, either acting as vigilantes, right? Or states where they're using their monopoly over the use of force, legitimate use of force and laws to implement, to legislate and enforce blasphemy laws. So I think one thing that I hope we can do through the discussion is really try to address it based on a particular country or perhaps a particular school of thought that may then apply to different countries. So my question is really about the secular versus religious legal divide, because one of the difficulties in analyzing or discussing quote unquote Islamic law is that one could argue, is there any country in the world right now that actually has a legal system that is an Islamic law system? Saudi Arabia, perhaps, Iran, perhaps, but I don't think any of the other Muslim majority countries, maybe Indonesia. I don't know the answers to these, but I do know that we talk about Islamic law as if there are even nation states that is their complete system, whereas the common model is really primarily secular law that is inherited by former colonial states in Europe, and then this mishmash of secular law that is again brought in from outside. Maybe some of it becomes indigenous through evolution, and then you add some Islamic law elements, with the exception of possibly family law, which tends to be more kind of consistent with Islamic law as one would theologically define it. And I'll just note that I am very suspicious that Islamic law is dominant in family law because that's where women's rights are implicated the most. So then you intersect with patriarchy, and it gets even more complicated. So I guess all that is to say, I'd like to kind of ask the question, and I'd like to ask Dr. Khaled Abou Fadl first, is how do you analyze blasphemy law, when you have 50 different countries and when you have secular law that is always interacting with Islamic law? And so where do we start? How do we understand blasphemy and Islamic law in this very complicated legal political context?
Well, Sahar, that's a very good question, and because yes, we are. I think people of conscience are offended when we see Muslims respond to perceived blasphemy or actual blasphemy or slander of their religious symbols, whatever they are, in violent ways. I mean, it's an embarrassment, but when it comes to that note of caution about how to approach blasphemy laws, because the truth of the matter is Islamic law, Islamic jurisprudence has not survived the colonial moment. It has been deconstructed quite purposely through colonialism, and all manifestations of Islamic law since colonialism are an extension of the colonial moment. So let me just very quickly give just a quick couple examples. Saudi, okay, who has been put to death or under threat of being put to death because of that class of laws that we can call blasphemy laws? Well, Saudi put to death a very, very prominent Shia scholar. I mean, in Nimr, one of the best, in my views, one of the best minds in the modern age on Sharia law, and he was executed part of the charges against him were apostasy and blasphemy. But everyone knows that this is because Nimr supported the Arab Spring and issued a very famous fatwa where he said that demonstrating against governments is an Islamic right. It's a matter of an actual haqq given by God. Hassan Farhan al-Maliki, who is a very prominent Saudi scholar, a very impressive scholar. I mean, his son is in the U.S. One of his sons is in the U.S. The family, has been in prison under threat of, again, being put to death. And when you look at what constitutes blasphemy and apostasy, it's his opinions about despotism. Salman al-Auda himself is under threat of being put to death, a very prominent scholar. In a country like Egypt, Egyptian law, and you're an expert in Egyptian law, I mean, is dira al-adyan. And then where did that language come from? It doesn't come from Islamic law. It doesn't come from the Islamic legal tradition. You could be charged with izdira al-adyan. It actually comes from a translation of a French legal opinion. I mean, it's sort of a literal translation. That, of course, I mean, it's sort of jumping on a French legal opinion. But anyway, and when you see the way Egypt has applied this izdira al-adyan, which literally translates into disrespecting or dishonoring religion, it's all over the place. I mean, a rather famous atheist / apostate like Sharif Gaber had a prison sentence. He served of a year in prison. He served a part of it. But at the same time, another person who has very famously critiqued the historicity of the Bible, the Coptic Church complained to the Egyptian government about him, and so he was arrested under the charges of izdira al-adyan. So I hear you that the picture is far from stereotypical when we get to country by country analysis. I shouldn't go too long. Okay, I'll stop here.
Thank you. And we have Mr.
And
Akil.
the name of the guy that was complained about by the Coptic Church and was imprisoned was Ahmed Sibea, by the way, just so in case people want to look up what I'm talking about. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you. No, and I think it's an important point that you really can't understand blasphemy law or how the people are engaging with it or the government's engaging with it without understanding the political context. Just in the same applies to France versus Spain versus Netherlands versus the UK. And so I just want to make that point that we've got to stop treating 1.5 billion people as if they're all robots and they're the same, and 50 different countries as if they're all the same when there's different languages. And so I just want to make sure we make that point. Professor Kuru and Dr. Mustafa Akil, you both have comments. Mustafa, would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. By the way, I'm not a doctor, but I appreciate the compliment. Thank you so much. I should say that. I mean, I think Professor Fadl's emphasis on blasphemy against the political ruler, right? I mean, the dictator, is also a very interesting aspect of this problem we're speaking about, because a lot of the people who will champion blasphemy laws will also say, you cannot speak against the ruler, that's fitna, right? I mean, that's standard view of Saudi Arabia, which reveals a culture where authority is, or respect to the authority is imposed by coercion, not won by, the speech and grace and so on and so forth. Like, authority has to punish you for any word that is disrespectful, you may say. It has secular versions too. I mean, in my country, Turkey, we had a law banning insulting Ataturk from 1920s on. We have a law that banned insulting the president, and it's being used incredibly, draconian way in the past 8 years, President Erdogan, more than 100,000 people have been sued for insulting the president online and so on and so forth. So I think beneath the layer of this blasphemy law in Islam we're speaking about, there is a kind of a authoritarian culture which doesn't come from Islam but maybe influenced Islam. I think we should speak about that too. But one more thing, Sahar, you're absolutely right that the legal traditions of Muslim countries are quite diverse. Some of them pretty secular. Some of them have Islamic law only in the family law. Most Arab countries are like that. A few of them are explicitly, claiming that the Sharia is the law of the land. But still, I think this doesn't negate the importance of thinking through blasphemy laws. First of all, blasphemy laws do not only lead to legal punishment, it leads to vigilante violence, right? That's a big, so those people are driven by not any secular law, but their conviction that whoever punishes the prophet should be punished. And legally, for example, in Pakistan, there was a colonial law about blasphemy, banning blasphemy. It was already there. So there is a colonial heritage here. But it was made much more severe during the Islamization of laws under General Zia-ul Haq. So if people have certain convictions, they can put it into legislation, even in a relatively or nation state context or a secular context. So you're absolutely right that it's diverse and not every Muslim society has the same patterns, but religious convictions do play a role in issues like this, in blasphemy or apostasy as well, I think.
Thank you. Professor Kuru?
Thank you, Sahar, for the question. In my field, comparative politics, we do similar comparison about Catholic countries. From 1972 to 1991, 95% of Catholic countries were authoritarian. And there was a Catholic question. Of course, every Catholic country had its own peculiarities, and we need experts on each of them. But the Vatican Council between 1962 and 1965 took the problem seriously, because until that time, the Catholic Church was denying democratic liberal values. Pope Pius in 1877 declared the idea of separation between church and state as a damned idea. And the idea that every individual can choose his or her religion is a condemned idea. But in the Vatican's Second Council, Catholic Church reversed those opinions and views. And then because of many geopolitical and otherwise reasons, Catholic world, so quote unquote, have experienced a democratization from Portugal and Spain to Latin America. Now we have two different audiences. To the Western audience, I absolutely agree with you that American students and everybody should know that Islamic world is very diverse. But we also have a Muslim audience from Turkey to Iran, from Saudi Arabia to Pakistan. I have many friends, followers, and students. And they define themselves as Muslim because all the countries are members of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. And Islamist, populist Islamist ideology are very influential in many of them. In terms of constitutional and legal system, out of 50 Muslim majority countries, 20 of them have secular constitutions. 20 of them have constitutions referring to Sharia, either as the source of law or a source of law or as a veto principle. And 10 of them are mixed without being secular or referring to constitution as Sharia. But in family law, as you say, that's the main issue. But let me conclude saying that the blasphemy and the issue is a part of teaching in madrasas. It's a part of teaching in mosques. And a famous Moroccan scholar, Jabiri, says that if you ask me to summarize Greek culture, I say the culture of philosophy. And if you ask me to pinpoint scholars to defining British and French philosophy, I said Descartes for French, Locke for Britain. If you ask me for Arab or Muslim, I say Shafi. And Imam Shafi is Usul al-Fiqh. So, and he is not saying that to give credit to Shafi, no, to criticize, saying that this fiqh views is very formal understanding of Islam, not the beauty Dr. Fadl emphasized. And according to fiqh interpretations, freedom of speech is very limited thing. And regardless whether the country is secular or Sharia based, we see the problem. Let me conclude with Turkey, secular republic, the first Turkish secular constitution, and now we have singers condemned and sometimes put in jail by having blasphemy or restriction of freedom of speech. So even in secular states, populist Islamist discourses are becoming more and more influential, restricting expression of and freedom of speech. Thank you.
Thank you. Radwan, Dr. Radwan?
Yes, I just want to add a very small point, but I think it's been mentioned, especially by Dr. Khalid Abou Fadl, the fact that this is definitely tied to the lack of democracy in the Arab world and in the Muslim world. We are mostly ruled by dictators, whether in the name of religion or in the name of secularism. They are dictators who do not want any debate. By definition, they are afraid of any debate about religion or about politics. So they tend to, clamp down. We don't want any discussion, any real debate about Islam itself or about the role of religion in politics or about politics itself. Everything is banned. So really, this is, in my opinion, really part of the struggle for democracy in Arab countries and in Muslim countries. We need to establish real democracy. The second point is, of course, we also need ijtihad. I've been speaking about ijtihad for 20 years, also as part of CSID, because yes, we need a modern interpretation of Islam, but that modern interpretation of Islam that is valid for the 21st century has to be genuine, has to come from within Islam itself, from within the scholars of Islam, from within the traditions of Islamic teachings and Islamic interpretation of the text. It takes time, it's very difficult. It needs freedom and democracy, but also we need to engage the religious scholars, the religious leaders in all these countries about all these questions of freedom, of democracy, of human rights, including the blasphemy laws. So it's a long struggle. In Tunisia, in the last 10 years, we have trained over 2,500 imams, more than 50% of the imams in the country. We had programs to train religious leaders and imams in Tunisia on democracy, on human rights, on freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and all these values. And I think that is really important and essential to modernizing our interpretation of Islam.
Thank you. So I will now turn to some of the Q&A questions, and I might bundle a few of them together if there's some common themes. So we have two questions which I think are related. The first one is, how are you all as scholars suggesting that blasphemy laws be modified or eliminated, which is both a kind of legal, theological, and political question. And then the second question is, instead of fighting against these laws, should we get more success in defining and advocating how Muslims should respond to blasphemy? And this kind of touches on the vigilantism that's happening that is against the laws of the state, right? I think what's really important is that when we hear of these egregious cases, which often are the only cases we hear about when we're talking, say, about coverage of Pakistan, we only hear about all these awful things that happen, and we're not hearing about the good things that happen in that country, whether in the name of Islam or not, is, nobody seems to discuss that this is actually against the law. People, even if there is blasphemy law on the books, it doesn't give license to people to go and murder and kill people without going through the legal system. And then the separate issue is whether blasphemy law on the books, is worthy of critique, and how is it justified through kind of theological bases. So the question is really a reformist question. So there's obviously a theological component to it. Is what are your positions that Islamic law does not allow for blasphemy law at all? Or is it that no, blasphemy law is permissible, but it's really about the way in which it's currently existent in country X or country Y that's Muslim majority, and it needs to be changed to be more aligned with Islamic law principles. So I will open that up to who wants to take. I see Professor Kuru, do you want to start?
Very quickly, in the European model, they first stop using the law, make it a dead letter in the book, then eventually start to repeal that away. Second, Ridwan and many others emphasize democratization, but we should also be clear about the concept. I recently reviewed a book defining Qaradawi as a Muslim Democrat. But then I say Qaradawi had in a famous or infamous speech says that if we didn't kill apostates in the time of Abu Bakr, we couldn't keep Islam. And he strongly support the idea. And then I say, how come someone defending killing the apostate presented as a Democrat? So the concept of democracy definitely requires a very deep respect to freedom of speech. Last but not least, in Pakistan and elsewhere, you are right that they are criminals who did the lynching. But we should not forget popular support. In Pakistan, the bodyguard who assassinated and murdered Punjab governor, then executed by the government of Pakistan and the courts, then radical in Pakistan established a political party to declare this murder as a murder. And it's now receiving 10% or so votes. So there is a very sociological problem we are seeing, radicalization in societies. That's really concerning. Thank you.
Thank you. Mustafa?
I'm sorry, there's no clear pathway here, but here's what I would say. First of all, my argument is that there is no basis for blasphemy laws in the Quran and Sunnah. So our religion doesn't call for it, despite the medieval jurisprudence. Now, this doesn't mean that states cannot make laws, separate from religion. States can do laws. Even in the classical Islam, you had the idea of state had to have taze punishments and so on and so forth. But then I would say it's not helpful and it's not right in itself. And I think one thing that Muslims who are discussing this issue should take into consideration is that when the idea of a blasphemy law becomes a norm in the world, it is not also good for us, especially when we are minorities, because in a Hindu majority country, Hindu mobs can come after you because with the beef you're eating, you're disrespecting Hindu religion and so on and so forth, which is happening in India, of course. So I think we should have a more serious conversation about this notion of freedom of speech. And generally, freedom of speech comes to us as something that the West is advocating that for their own agendas and so on and so forth. And sometimes the West can have double standards or some agendas indeed or not. That's a different question. But is this a value that we really need? Our religion doesn't call for blasphemy laws, plus freedom of speech is a good thing, because when we don't have it, we have dictators who silence speech in our countries and oppress us. When we don't have freedom of speech, Muslims intellectuals who just have different ideas from the mainstream can be targeted, killed, and condemned, which has happened in Egypt, Sudan, and in various countries over the decades. So this is a value that we need. And again, finally, we should not, I don't advocate freedom of speech so that I hear all the nasty words, but the fact that I think we will bring more respect to Islam is precisely we won't have these laws and blasphemy or apostasy. I think by having these things, we are only provoking disrespectful words to Islam, as we have seen in the past couple of decades, especially in the West. How will we go there? It's a huge transformation, but let's not forget that we were able to abolish slavery. It wasn't easy. There were people who were defending slavery 150 years ago, saying that it's in the Sharia. Ultimately, it dawned on too many Islamic scholars to say that it wasn't what Islam wanted. It just Islam founded it, and ultimately we wanted to abolish it. Now we can only do it. So these changes are possible, but it needs intellectual effort. It needs scholars to speak out. There are many scholars who are speaking out. And on that note, I should also say, I would recommend a phenomenal book published 2 years ago, Freedom of Speech in Islam, Challenging Blasphemy and Apostasy Laws, written by a team of scholars, edited by the great Pakistani scholar, Muhammad Khalid Masood. who has some of the many of the facts that we're speaking today. So there are efforts like this, and I think Muslim media should give them more voice. We should have more probably conversations like this.
Thank you. And Dr. Abu Fadl, I want to turn to you, but I just want to make one point. You know, we want to be careful. We are in the United States, and so we are socialized, I think, to privilege and perhaps fetishize American free speech rights, and to take a very purist and expansive approach. But you know, the people on the other side of the Atlantic that are supposed to be kind of within the same historical tradition don't have the same approach, right? In France and in Germany and in the UK and others, where there are hate speech laws. And we've certainly paid a price for having a very expansive free speech environment where we've got polarization, we've got hate crimes, we've got minorities who are in fact living second-class lives because many people who are quite powerful and influential can say things that are very harmful and have real impact on minorities, including Muslims. And so this isn't me saying that we necessarily should abolish or change our free speech model, but we should acknowledge that there is a cost and there are certain groups that pay a higher burden, and that sometimes allowing people to say whatever they want that is very insidious and hateful and harmful and often false can also be harmful to society, right? And can have divisive effects that you know other countries may say we don't want that in our society. So I just want to make sure that we're not kind of just copying and pasting the imperfect American model. But before I get to you, Dr. Khalid Abu Fadl, I see that Dr. Bashir has his hand up, and then I definitely want to hear Dr. Khalid's comments, especially on the theology of blasphemy laws and whether we could have, you know, whether Islamic law requires it or not. Dr. Bashir?
Oh, I have a very simple question. The blasphemy laws are devised to discourage blasphemy. What I am seeing is encouraging the blasphemy. So are these laws applicable today where it is not serving its purpose? So I have a very strong recommendation. Number one, that all Sharia laws must be revised because these are devised by human beings based on their interpretation of Quran and Prophet's teaching, and this was devised in the medieval period. Are we interpreting the Quran the same ways, or it has changed our understanding of the world and we have to revise our interpretation? But the most important point is, if it is not serving its purpose, if it is increasing the blasphemy, why should we have the blasphemy laws? Thanks.
Thank you. Dr. Abu Fadl? You're muted.
Oh yeah, I'm pressing on the wrong button. Sorry. No, thank you, Sahar. Listen, okay, so there have been actually fairly good works challenging the legality of apostasy, punishment of apostasy, and punishment of blasphemy. I mean, in English, Muhammad Hisham Kamali wrote a book, Freedom of Expression in Islam, and also I should flag Muhammad Khalid Masoud's book. I think that's a book that was just mentioned as well. And there have been people like Gamal al-Banna in Arabic who's written about this extensively and again challenged the same. And I agree that punishing blasphemy or apostasy is very difficult to reconcile with the normative ethics of the Quran. I mean, the Quran, I think, could not have been more clear. Man sha'a falyu'min wa man sha'a falyakfur. فذكر ما أنت إلا مذكر لست عليهم مسيطر. So remind them or call or or invite them to the faith, but you don't control them, and you have no authority to control them. And we can unpack, and some scholars have unpacked how the historical decision made to fight the apostasy wars was interpreted by Muslim jurists to say, well, you know, what Abu Bakr did was not inconsistent with the Quran, because if Abu Bakr made the decision to fight those who apostated from Islam, that it must be right to punish those who commit apostasy. And I think it is time for us to get serious about our history and reclaim our history and reinterpret our jurisprudence by liberating it from sometimes the heavy shackles of history. But Sahar, what I want to say, the problem is that in order for people to have a reasoned discussion about their history, they must take their history seriously and with an open mind. And we are a people, and I say this, and I hope it doesn't shock anyone. We are a people in the modern contemporary moment without a history. I think we don't take our history seriously. We don't take our historical, I mean, compare European historiography to, or even emerging historiography on Asia, to the historiography on the Islamic civilization. I mean, the works produced in Arabic and Persian and Turkish are reductive and derivative, and for the most part, marginal. And the authoritative voices about Muslim history still remains in the West. And if you can't reclaim your history, if you don't control your own history, then you're always in a reactive mode. What often happens with reform, I'll give you just one example. And again, you know, I'll give the example of Egypt. Okay, so I knew, and he used to be a friend, this man called Ibrahim Isa, right? And Ibrahim Isa is supposed to be this reformer, right? And I used to take Ibrahim Isa seriously, and I used to actually like him as a liberal, you know, daring, revolutionary thinker. But suddenly, everything Ibrahim Isa said immensely repulses me. When I saw Ibrahim Isa completely subservient, a complete sellout to a despot who's equal to the Pharaoh himself, Pharaoh, you know, in the Quran, who's the prototype of despotism? It's Pharaoh, the Pharaoh. And so here is a Pharaoh that is constantly telling us Islam needs to be reformed, and puts Ibrahim Isa as his mouthpiece, one of his mouthpieces, to tell us how, you know, we should be critical of the legacy of the companions, we should be critical of the legacy of the prophet, we should be critical of this, critical of that, we should reinterpret everything. And the minute you come close, even hint any criticism of Sisi and his government, suddenly the liberality, all the liberalism of Ibrahim Isa ceases to be. And you go into, you know, psychotic fits. Oh, no, you can't say anything. Are you blaming Sisi? Are you really criticizing? The same thing was Nawal Saad, the late Nawal Saadawi, who I knew quite well. And, you know, you banned Muhammad Amara, an Islamic thinker, who, by the way, was very critical of blasphemy laws and apostasy law. Sisi's government banned Muhammad Amara from appearing on TV, from publishing in any literary outlet. Similarly banned Fahmi Huwaidi, who was also a critic of blasphemy laws and apostasy laws. and you embrace Ibrahim Isa and Nawal Saadawi, and then people wonder, why isn't it that Muslims are reclaiming and reinterpreting bravely their tradition? Because it's all screwed up, because it's really, really messed up. Because the minute the Muslim starts dreaming of liberty and democracy and rights, there are so many forces that line up to say, no, you're an exception to humanity. You're not entitled to these things. And that type of racism, to put it quite simply, bluntly, is a deconstructive racism that locks the Muslim mind in an endless pathology that the Muslim mind can't break out of. Okay.
Thank you. Well, I have to put a plug in for The Racial Muslim, my book.
Yes, absolutely. I used it in my class. And by the way, Sahar, all the students in the class agreed that that was their favorite reading of all the books I've assigned.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Tell them I said thank you. And because I agree with you. I think that and this is what people who don't study this very diverse Muslim world that we call one, but Muslim majority societies, I don't think appreciate, is not only are they all very different, but that there are so many forces that are producing these results. And it's not simply theological interpretations, right? Or religious zealotry. It's so complicated, like any nation, and that sometimes you will see this bad outcome, and you shouldn't assume it's just this direct causal line between religious zealotry or kind of medieval thinking and then vigilantism, whether it's against women or it's against religious minorities or it's against religious dissidents. Oftentimes there are so many different factors at play, and that's not to be apologist, because there certainly are religious zealots all over the world that are Muslim and that are Christian and that are Jewish and that are Hindu and that are of different faiths. But it's just the way in which we, in the West anyway, we only direct all of that criticism at Islam, at Muslim majority societies. So we have about 5 minutes left. I'd like Professor Kuru and Mr. Akyol to comment, because I see their hands up. And then I want to make sure that we give Dr. Bashir and Dr. Masmoudi an opportunity to say any closing remarks. So Mustafa, would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, Dr. Fadl made another good point that there are these authoritarian countries in the Gulf, sometimes whose leaders come up with reformists of Islam. They said Islam should be reformed, and by that they mean allowing women to drive a car or something, which of course should happen. That's an important reform. But I would say, yes, Islam should be reformed, and the first thing we need, the Islamic understanding needs reform. But the number one reform we need is a teaching which says the ruler should be obeyed, even if he's a tyrant, which is explicitly said, unfortunately, in some of our classical texts, and of course upheld by these regimes. So, I mean, the political authoritarianism cannot be justified by making some cosmetic reforms on here and there. So, and I think that's a very important point. One thing though on Sahar, you made a great point, and may I slightly disagree with all the respect. The difference between US and US standards of free speech and European ones. That's true. US standards of freedom of speech and religion is generally higher than European ones, as in particular France. And I have the full conviction that the US standards are better for everybody, including us. Just look at religious expression, look at the headscarf bans, hijab bans in France. Look at the bans they're creating now on separatism. I mean, an imam was just expelled in France because he's doing separatism, right? Whereas with First Amendment rights in the US, I think Muslims have more freedom to say what they say, even if it doesn't go well with the common sensibilities of society. Let's not forget that hate speech laws can be used against us as well. Someone can say, oh, there's some hate speech in the Quran. What? Unbelievers will go to hell. That's so disrespectful to atheists. And well, that's what the Quran says, that's our teaching, like it or not. So, and there are people who actually go against the Quran with that argument, in this Islamophobic politician in Holland, for example. So in a medium of freedom, there will be terrible things to hear, but I think a medium of freedom is better for everybody. Of course, when it doesn't turn into a religion, into incitement and so on and so forth. So I just wanted to make that point, and that is, I think, the key issue when we're discussing these things. Is this idea of free speech and freedom of religion fundamentally a good thing for everybody, and including us Muslims as well? And my answer is yes. Thank you.
That's a fair contention. This is a hot topic of debate in legal circles, but there's no perfect system, right?
Oh yeah, for sure.
And so we just want to acknowledge that. I think my point was that we're very quick to point out the downsides to the European model, but I don't think that we acknowledge the downsides to our model, so that we at least decide intentionally and purposely, are we willing to pay that price, and who's paying those prices? And yes, inevitably, whenever you have rules, it's those who get to make those rules that will make them in a way that benefits them. I think that's just the human condition, unfortunately. Professor Kuru, you had a comment,
Yes.
and then Dr. Bashir,
Yes.
the third one, and then we'll close out. Yes.
So very quick, three things. First, I agree with Mustafa that there should be harm principle. As long as we do not harm each other, there should be freedom of speech. Second, books mentioned, very good. And a recent one, Mohsin Kadiwar, Blasphemy and Apostasy in Islam, from both Sunni and Shia. He is from a Shia tradition, but also referred to Sunni. Last but not least, to clarify for the audience that we are not simply discussing apostasy as those who say, I was Muslim, I leave Muslim, self-confess apostasy. No, because since the time of at least Ghazali's declaration of Ibn Sina and Farabi as apostates, Muslims who says, I am Muslim, still declare apostate for very simple things that in Turkish we say elfaz-ı küfür. When I was a child, they taught me that if, for example, the Prophet likes to eat eggplant, and if I say I don't like eggplant, I became a kafir. So this is a childish definition of apostasy, but the established norm in fiqh, if the ulama has an ijma, like for example, beer is haram. If a Muslim reformist come up with the idea that no, beer can be halal, they can declare the person apostate. This is a very serious issue that closes any internal discussion about Islam and make people fearful of being declared as a non-Muslim, although you pray 5 times a day, you are fasting and doing everything and declare yourself Muslim, still with a single idea, even thinking that idea in your mind, oh, maybe beer is halal, automatically you become an apostate. That's a very dangerous view and close down any internal debate in Islam. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Bashir?
Yeah, just a very brief response. I think it's boiled down to that we are talking about freedom of speech. And it's becoming a very complex issue. Hundreds of articles are written, and I have read Professor Abul Fadl, scholarly writings, Shaykh Albani, I have read about it, Professor Kamali from Malaya, and several seminars have been held. I think it's time that we need to initiate a movement to seriously revise or abolish the blasphemy laws. In fact, the entire Sharia law has to be reviewed. There is no reason why we simply have to accept what is written in 7th to 11th century, and after that it is stopped. So I request all the professors to think about how can we initiate a movement to revise and to abolish these laws. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Masmoudi, you have the final comments?
Well, my final comment is, again, thank you all very much for very, very insightful discussion. Obviously, we need more of these debates. We need more of these discussions. It's a long-term project to change the situation in the Muslim world and to change the mindset, not only of the religious leaders and establishment, but also of the Muslims in general, the people in general in these countries. It leads me to one final question that I think is very important and very relevant is, who speaks for Islam? Authoritarian regimes, of course, they want to claim that they do, they speak for Islam. Or they create an institution like Al-Azhar University, and they try to say, okay, Al-Azhar University speaks for Islam. The problem is under a dictatorship, like in Egypt today, Al-Azhar University cannot really have the freedom to say what it wants. It basically has to repeat whatever the government is saying, So if there is no freedom, then there is not even an institution to speak for Islam. But more than that, in true Islam, there is no institution to speak for Islam. In true Islam, there is no one to speak for Islam. All of us speak for Islam. All of us are, as Muslims, have the right to say our opinion and what we think Islam is. There is no one, there is no authority that speaks in the name of Islam or in the name of God. It complicates things, it makes it interesting. In my opinion, it makes it more democratic, not less democratic, that we don't have a church or an institution that says, this position, my position, is the only official position of Islam, the only true position of Islam. And if you disagree with me, you're not a real Muslim or a good Muslim. There is no such institution in Islam. In reality, we all speak for Islam, and it's time that we speak louder and that we become more organized, and we take our right back to defend and define what Islam is. In the end, we have to convince the majority of Muslims. That's the real test. We have to convince the majority of the Muslims in the world, or here in America, that what we are saying is true, that what we are saying is genuine, and what we are saying reflects the true values of Islam, not imposed by this regime or this university or that university. It's a matter of conviction, and we have a lot of work to do. And I hope that we can all join hands and continue the struggle for freedom and democracy and freedom of expression all over the world, but especially in the Muslim world. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. And thank you, Sahar, for wonderful moderation of the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And I hope that everyone that watched will follow up by reading our work, all of the scholars' works. There is actually a bibliography on Muslims and Islam in America, all the books about Muslims and Islam in America that you can Google and you'll find it very easily. And then finally, keep up with the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy and the Center for Security, Race and Rights that I lead. I better put a plug in for that. And inshallah, we'll see you at the next event.
Inshallah. Thank you so much. This was wonderful.
Assalamu
Inshallah. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
It's an honor. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you. Alaikum salam.
Salam.